Well, now the third speaker today, Professor Avishai Margalit, an emeritus professor of philosophy at the Hebrew University, whom I still remember riding his bicycle in the streets of Rehavia and here just over the hill where I lived, and he came to visit another girl. And he studied and taught at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem his whole career, and since 2006, he was the George Kennan Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. This comes back to the same points of excellence. He contributed to various fields of philosophy, but what made him cooperate with Menahem was their joint interest in economics and philosophy. This is perhaps one of the special aspects, you mentioned it also, of Menachem's being an economist. He's not really an economist. If you ask him about questions of today's economics in Israel, that's not where you would get an answer. This is not Menachem. There are other things that he could also already for 60 years. This is quite amazing. This combination of economics and philosophy is unique to Menachem, but it's also unique from the other side to Avishai, who is a professor of economics. A number of years ago, let me just tell you, I was thinking about it as I prepared this introduction. Menachem gave an interview in the series of personal interviews that Academy members give and are being placed in the Academy site, and you can watch it if that's what interests you. But Menachem gave an interview to two interviewers, to Avishai and Harel Rubinstein. And in his typical effort to avoid speaking about himself, which was the point of this interview, he managed to sneak into this interview a laudatio for Avishai Margalit, the like of which one only very rarely hears. So Avishai, after having reheard this interview, Avishai is for me no doubt a most fitting speaker today, and he's invited now to speak to us.
I guess you know the feeling of facing a blank page and nervously searching for an opening line. You are in search of a magical open sesame, believing that the cave which had your treasured thought would be wide open. I have no iftach, ya sumsum of my own, so let me use others' openings line. One such line needs context. Chaim Gvati was a minister of agriculture in our country, a very shrewd kibbutznik. When Gvati turned 70, his kibbutz celebrated his birthday. One by one, the speakers sang his praise. Then the old fox stood up to respond. His opening line was, "Comrades, I'm not as good as you say and not as bad as you think." Menachem, I believe, is a rare specimen. He doesn't leave any gap between the praise people are willing to shower on him in public and what they think of him in the heart. Another opening line comes to my mind. I'm not sure about its origin. I guess I met it in a book on ambiguities. It tells us about a speaker who scans his audience and then says, "Friends, I know you all too well to call you ladies and gentlemen." Well, in our country, you probably need an Aladdin wonder lamp to find a gentleman. But in the case of Menahem, there is no need for such a lamp. He is recognized as a gentleman in broad daylight. But then I'm not here to praise Menahem, let alone bury him. Instead, I am about to make few comments related to philosophy and economics. These comments are inspired by a joint graduate seminar that Menahem and I held for students of economics and philosophy. The seminar originated in the late 70s, and its format was carried on for many successive years. Broadly speaking, the concerns of the seminar was various aspects of rationality and economic justice. It covered a great deal of related topics, such as logical paradoxes, but most centrally, distributive justice. Economic life is a product of human beings. Does this fact secure the possibility, in principle, of knowing everything worth knowing about our economic life? There is an assumption which is with us from the creation of the hills. Tersely put, it says that the creator can understand in full the product of his creation. The potter is a paradigm case for this assumption. Indeed, the Bible tells us that Jeremiah was sent by God to a pottery workshop to see how the potter creates and mends his creation. It enabled Jeremiah to see a creator in total mastery and understanding of his work. This was meant to be a parable for God the Creator, the potter of the universe, who understands the world completely and can modify it at will. The Creator's assumption centered on the idea that human civilization, which is a product of human creation, can in principle be understood completely by its creators, namely human beings. Marx, for one, was strongly committed to this view. Yet a subversive but an esoteric idea emerged early on. It came to the forefront with the legends about the golem. The golem is an artificial creature in the form of human, which was animated by its human creator with the help of magical means. The most famous golem, the legend has it, was animated by the illustrious Rabbi of Prague, known by the acronym Harel. The story of his golem is the source of the expression in Hebrew of a golem that turned against its creator. It so happened that the magical password for the golem activation went wrong, and the golem ran amok. This became paradigm for human creation running out of human control. Karl Čapek, a noted Prague writer of the last century, in telling the story of the golem, coined for it the term robot, based on robota, which is serf labor in Czech. The fear of robot running out of control as a sign of not fully understanding our creation casts nowadays its dark shadow in the form of AI. With AI, we have a robot programmed by humans. Its algorithm is known, yet we don't know for the hell of it how it does what it does. We seem to be like the wither's apprentice who enchants a broom only to discover, as in Goethe's poem, that we cannot get rid of the programming we summoned. How knowledge of economy related to the creation assumption rather to the creation fallacy? In the 1930s, a formative debate among economists took place. The bone of contention revolved around the issue of knowledge and planning. The debate was strongly colored by ideology, socialism on the one hand and capitalism on the other. The ideological colors mask a serious debate about the knowledge needed to understand the economy. The salient protagonists of the debates were Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek on the capitalist team, and Oskar Lange and Abba Lerner on the socialist team, or more precisely, on the market socialist team. Hayek famously claimed that there are two kinds of knowledge needed to account for the economy: theoretical knowledge and local knowledge. Theoretical knowledge is the one we recognize as scientific knowledge, which lends itself to mathematical formulation. It is the kind we meet in theoretical economics. Local knowledge is knowledge that concerns agents in the market. It is local in terms of time and space. It is dispersed among the agents in the market, each with its own subjective and narrow perspective. Hayek's claim was that to believe that theoretical economics can assimilate the dispersed local knowledge of millions of economic agents and store it in one mind is an illusion. Especially if we have in the mind the Gosplan, the Soviet State Plan Committee. The Gosplan is an incarnation of the creator's fallacy. There is no mind that can encompass all the information needed to rationally plan the economy. Thus spake Hayek. Lange and Lerner planned economy is market socialism. The socialist part of it is the tenet that ownership over the means of production, apart from labor, belongs to the socialist state. The two recognize the importance of the price system as a device for signaling how to achieve coordination between producers and consumers. They suggested a way to simulate the information conveyed by prices while sparing the irrationality of its failure. This is far from the clumsy way the Soviet type of Gosplan worked, but theirs was never implemented in practice. Indeed, as early as 1965, Lange realized the potential of robots as tool for maintaining the creator's assumption, namely for handling the needed information for rational planning. I expanded a bit on what is dubbed the socialist calculation debate to give you a glimpse of the ideological climate that still hovered around at the time that Menachem was introduced to economics. I mentioned already Abba Lerner's name. It was he who initiated young Menachem into study of economics. Lerner was by then more of a social democrat than a socialist. Namely, he believed more strongly in democracy than in the need for social ownership over means of production. Lerner was a neighbor of Menachem. He befriended Menachem's father, an esteemed writer, who, if I am not mistaken, taught Lerner's Hebrew. Lerner in no time spotted the brightness of the young Menachem and urged him to join his class at the Hebrew University while he was still in high school. Lucky Menachem. He had been baptized as an economist by Lerner and was later ordained by Kenneth Harel. It doesn't get much better than this. It was the philosopher David Hume, on whom Ken Binmore conferred the title the grandfather of modern economics, who hammered the distinction between is and ought. Hume's distinction was transfigured in economics into the distinction between positive and normative economics. Positive economics describes what is the case, while the normative economics prescribe what ought to be the case. The distinction is shaky, partly because the economics is tied to policy recommendations, and policy is ridden with normative evaluations. There is no harm in calling Menachem a normative economist, for his branches of social study, social choice, game theory, and decision theory all revolve around the normative concept of rationality. Following Hume, rationality deals with means rather than ends. Hume pronounced that reason ought to be the slave of the passions, meaning that our wants, not our reasons, determine our ends. Reason has a role only insofar as shaping the means to the ends. Hume is willing to swallow the whole hog and declares, it is not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger. My reaction to Hume's astonishing pronouncement is to borrow from Lady Caroline Lamb's description of Byron and call the Hume finger scratcher mad, bad, and dangerous to know, an exemplary of unreason. But Hume's line carried the day with modern economists. They use lean logical tests for rationality, which is logical consistency. Thus, rationality means subscribing only to a set of statements which can possibly be held true together. In short, rationality means avoiding logical contradiction. But there is another evaluative concept which creeps into welfare economics, and it is justice. And you heard the marvelous comments of Eric. Biographically, this is not surprising that Menachem has a strong sense of justice, which means he reacts strongly when he faced with injustice. I, for one, maintain that it is not justice that draws us into action, but, if at all, it is reaction to injustice. Distributive justice nowadays is at the center of the political life in what the poet Dennis Seal called our punished land. It surrounds a bitter public reaction to the injustice in the allocation of the burdens of the current endless war. Though allocations of burdens and benefits engulf us in almost everything we do, the burden of war has an especially painful role. It is about life and death. Menahem wrote a seminal article about economic justice, which is very different from the one that Eric mentioned, that of Menahem and Maya, which was in positive economics. This is in normative economics. It is called Rawls, Edgeworth, Shapley, Nash, and its subtitle is Theories of Distributive Justice Re-Examined. In re-examining the abundant literature on distributive justice, Menahem finds the whole area in considerable disarray. Note, and I quote, "No two writers agree with what a third writer had said, let alone agree on the existing body of assertions," end of quote. Menahem credits the philosopher John Rawls with stating precisely what the theory of distributive justice is about. Moreover, Rawls suggests a theory of his own. He calls his theory justice as fairness and contrasts it with the utilitarianism as he defines it. It is Rawls' account of utilitarianism that Menahem finds wanting, so he calls for the help from Edgeworth, Shapley, and Nash. It is hard to exaggerate the influence of Rawls in reviving the interest in dealing with social justice and within it, distributive justice. His idea is that inequalities in society, both social and economic, should benefit most those who are least advantaged. By those most in need, he means those who belong to the lowest income class. I believe, and speaking for myself, that those who are most in need should be replaced with those who are the most vulnerable. This is the way I understand the repeated example in the Bible of the widow and the orphan as the test of justice. The two are not necessarily among the poorest, but are among the most vulnerable. The cardinal sin of Rawls in the eyes of many utilitarians was his dependence on interpersonal comparison. For Rawls, the utterance, Adam is better off under distribution scheme A than Eve under distribution B is meaningful. Whereas for many utilitarians, it is meaningless. Menahem tried to retain Rawls' distributive insight while removing from it the sin of interpersonal comparison. He used Shapley's scheme and formed the combined rigorous scheme of Rawls and Shapley. This scheme is an expression of justice as fairness. Menachem's account of Rawls and Shapley has a surprising result. This scheme is yielded by Nash's bargaining theory. It is surprising that for Nash's scheme has strong bias in favor of the rich against the poor, not a good recipe for social justice. Yet Menahem doesn't lose hope of eliminating the bias in favor of the rich. I took for granted that justice is fairness, but is it? The philosopher and wit Sidney Morgenbesser was once interviewed as a candidate for serving on a jury. Were you ever treated unjustly and unfairly by the police, he was asked. Well, he said, during the riots at Columbia University over the Vietnam War, I was once treated by the police unjustly but fairly. Then he explained, the policemen clubbed my head, which was unjust, but then they clubbed the heads of everybody else, which was only fair. It seems that we are returning to the scenes from the 60s these days, and I hope that the spirit of Menachem, that justice and fairness will go hand in hand.